I spent 3 years dodging IEDs and eating dust in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, dreaming every single night about the smell of pine needles and the way the fog sits on Spirit Lake at dawn, only to come home and find a plastic surgery nightmare in a golf cart trying to sell my soul for a commission. My name is Elias Thorne, and before you ask, yeah, I'm a combat engineer, which means I spent my 20s learning exactly how things are built and, more importantly, exactly how to take them apart when they're standing in the way of justice. When I pulled my rusted F-150 onto the gravel road my grandfather carved out of the Minnesota wilderness back in the 70s, I wasn't expecting a brass band, but I sure as hell wasn't an Oppos. Expecting a 10-foot wrought iron gate with a keypad and a sign that said, in quote, "The Sanctuary at Pinecrest, residents only," end quote. I sat there for a second, the engine idling, my knuckles turning white on the steering wheel, because I knew, geographically speaking, I was standing on thorn land, but visually, it looked like some suburban developer had vomited a country club over my family and Oppo's legacy. I didn't even have time to get out before this woman came screaming down the hill in a customized golf cart. You know, the type lifted tires, chrome trim, probably cost more than my first truck, and she's waving a manicured hand at me like she's shooing a stray dog. This was Regina Vance, a woman who looked like she'd spent the last decade fighting a losing war against aging with Botox and spite, and the second I rolled down my window, the smell of expensive, cloying perfume hit me like a chemical weapon. End quote. This is a private community, sir, and we don an Oppos. Allow loitering or unauthorized vehicles, end quote. She snapped, her voice like a jagged piece of glass rubbing against silk. I just stared at her, feeling that old military calm settle over me, that cold clarity you get when you're looking at a minefield. I told her, in quote, "Mind Oppos, I'm not loitering, I'm going home," end quote. And I pointed past her to the old cedar cabin tucked behind the trees, the one my granddad built with his own 2 hands, but she just laughed, this high-pitched, ugly sound that didn't end Oppos. Reach her eyes. She leaned over and told me that the end quote, Thorn Shack, end quote, was an eyesore slated for demolition and that I was trespassing on HOA-managed common ground, claiming that the owner had passed away and the sand and the land had been, end quote, absorbed, end quote, for the greater good of the community. That was the moment the world went quiet for me, because not only was she standing on my dirt, she was standing on my grave while I was still breathing, and she had no idea that the man she was trying to bully had spent the last 36 months learning how to dismantle much bigger problems than a divorcee with a power trip. I didn't an Oppos. I didn't an Oppos. Get out and cause a scene. I just reached into my glove box, pulled out the original deed with the county seal, and pressed it against the glass while I whispered, in quote, "Regina, I'm Elias Thorne, I'm very much alive, and you have exactly 5 minutes to get this gate open before I use my winch to turn it into scrap metal," end quote. Her face went from that fake porcelain tan to a sickly shade of gray in about 3 seconds because she realized the ghost had come back to claim the haunted house. And as the gate buzzed open, I knew this wasn't Oppos. Just a misunderstanding. It was a war. I spent the first night in my cabin, which smelled like stale air and betrayal, discovering that she hadn't and Oppos. Just put up a gate. She'd turned my life into a crime scene. She'd broken in, boxed up my mother's old quilts and my grandfather's journals, and tossed them into a damp shed like they were trash, all while she'd staged the main room with rented furniture to show to potential buyers as a, end quote, rustic guest house, end quote. It was a level of audacity I couldn't and Oppos to even wrap my head around, but as I sat there by the fireplace, drinking lukewarm coffee and listening to the wind, I realized Regina Vance wasn't an Oppos. Just some crazy neighbor. She was a predator who had timed her move perfectly. She'd moved in 2 years ago, bought the smallest, ugliest lot on the edge of our road, and then proceeded to, end quote, civilize, end quote, the area by declaring herself the president of an HOA that didn't end Oppos. Exist when I left, convincing the older folks like Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson that I was dead, and that she was the only one who could keep the, end quote, riffraff, end quote, out. The next morning, I didn't an Oppos to go to her house to argue. I went to the county courthouse in the city, because the Army taught me that you never fire a shot until you know exactly where the enemy's ammo dump is hidden. I spent 6 hours in the basement of the records office, breathing in the scent of old paper and ink, and what I found made my blood run colder than a Minnesota winter. Regina Vance hadn't end oppos. T just lied to the neighbors. She performed a surgical strike on the local bureaucracy, filing in quote, emergency in quote, petitions to rezone the access road as a private easement, claiming it was for in quote, erosion control in quote, and in quote, safety in quote, all while neglecting to mention that the primary owner of the land was currently serving in a combat zone. But the real in quote, smoking gun in quote, the thing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up was her own financial record. She was drowning, and I mean really sinking, with a divorce settlement that was tied to her property value and a mortgage that was currently in the early stages of foreclosure. See, Regina didn't end oppos. T won my land because she liked the view. She needed my land because lakefront access in Spirit Lake is the difference between a $300,000 house and $1 million estate, and she was trying to, in quote, annex in quote, my shoreline to save her own skin from a bank. She'd been charging the neighbors in quote, security fees in quote, and in quote, road assessments and quote, pocketing nearly $3,000 a month from terrified seniors who thought they'd lose their homes if they didn't end oppos. T pay her, and she was using that money to pay for her luxury SUV and her manicures while she waited for the clock to run out on my, in quote, abandonment. In quote, I realized then that she wasn't in oppos. T just a bully. She was a con artist who had weaponized the concept of a, in quote, neighborhood, in quote, to create a personal piggy bank, and the level of calculated cruelty it took to tell my 80-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Gable, that I'd been blown up just so she could charge her $50 to drive to the grocery store. Well, that was the moment I stopped being a neighbor and started being a combat engineer again. The escalation started small. I came home to find, in quote, no trespassing, in quote, signs nailed into the ancient oaks my grandfather had planted, and Regina had the nerve to call the sheriff claiming I was, in quote, brandishing a weapon, in quote, because I was carrying a chainsaw to clear some brush. The sheriff, a guy named Miller who I'd played football with in high school, just shook his head and told me, in quote, Elias, she's got a paper trail a mile long, and until a judge tells her stop, she's the end oppos, acting authority in oppos for this HOA thing she's built. End quote. I looked him in the eye and said, in quote, Miller, if the law is a paper trail, I'm about to start writing a book, end quote. And that's when I reached out to my old unit's JAG officer and a local real estate attorney who looked like he chewed on nails for breakfast. We didn't end oppos. T just file a lawsuit. We initiated a, in quote, quiet title, in quote, action, which is a fancy legal way of saying, in quote, everybody shut up and show me your receipts, in quote, and we serve her papers right in the middle of one of her fake, in quote, community garden parties, in quote, she was hosting on my lawn. I watched from my porch as she took the envelope, her face twisting into this mask of pure, unadulterated rage, and she marched across the grass, heels sinking into the soft mud, screaming that I was a, and quote, traumatized vet, end quote, who didn't end oppos. T understand how the modern world worked. She actually had the gall to tell me that my grandfather's land was, in quote, wasted, in quote, on someone like me, and that the community deserved a, end quote, cohesive vision, end quote, which I'm pretty sure is just Karen speak for, end quote. I want your stuff for free, end quote, but I had my own vision, and it involved the 2 a.m. discovery in her own social media posts where she was bragging about the, end quote, new docks, end quote. She was installing docks that were being built over protected wetlands without a single permit from the Department of Natural Resources. The week of the, end quote, final showdown, end quote, Regina went nuclear. She tried to have my cabin condemned by calling an a, end quote, health hazard, end quote, tip about my septic tank, and she even sent a letter to my commanding officer claiming I was a threat to public safety. She didn't in oppos. T realized that when you attack a soldier in oppos, as career with lies, the Army doesn't end oppos. T just get annoyed. They send a very professional, very terrifying legal team to see who's trying to mess with their assets. By the time the DNR, the county assessor, and the JAG representative all showed up on the same Tuesday, Regina was standing on her porch like a queen whose castle was made of cardboard and the rain was just starting to F.A. LL. We found out she'd embezzled over $60,000 from the, end quote, sanctuary, end quote, fund, money that was supposed to be for road paving but had actually gone toward her alimony-induced debt. And the end quote, private end quote, gate sheet installed was actually blocking a designated fire access route, which meant the county wasn't oppose. T just going to ask her to move it. They were going to fine her into the next century. I remember the look on her face when the DNR officer told her she'd have to pay to restore the wetland she'd destroyed. It was the look of a person who realized that the end quote, common criminal end quote, she tried to bully was actually the one holding all the cards. But the most cinematic part, the part I'll tell my grandkids about, was when we finally got the court order to remove that gate. I didn't end oppose. T let the county do it. I did it myself. I hooked my truck up to those fancy wrought iron bars, the ones she'd used to extort my neighbors and lock me out of my own life, and I put that F-150 in 4-low. The sound of that metal groaning and snapping was the sweetest music I'd heard since the day I stepped off the transport plane, and as I dragged that gate down the road, Regina was standing there in her designer sunglasses, crying not because she was sorry, but because her end quote, alimony shield end quote, was finally shattered. She lost the house a month later to foreclosure, and the end quote, sanctuary at Pine Crest end quote, reverted back to what it was always meant to be. Spirit Lake, a place where people look out for each other instead of looking for a way to profit off their neighbors. Now, I spend my mornings on the porch, the same porch my granddad sat on, watching the eagles circle the lake, and the end quote, no trespassing end quote, signs are gone, replaced by a simple one that says end quote, Thorns Landing, all are welcome except the HOA, end quote. But here's the thing that still keeps me up sometimes, and the reason I'm sharing this. Regina wasn't oppose, T an anomaly. She was just the only one who got caught. There are thousands of these, end quote, mini dictators, end quote, out there, people who think that a title like, end quote, president, end quote, gives them the right to rewrite the law and steal a person and oppose as history while they're away defending the very freedom these bullies use as a shield. I got my land back and I got my peace, but it cost me a year of my life and a lot of faith in the, end quote, system, end quote, that allowed her to get that far in the first place. It makes you wonder, doesn't it oppose? T it? If I hadn't oppose, T been a combat engineer. If I hadn't oppose, T had the resources to fight back. Would Regina Vance be sitting in my grandfather's chair right now, sipping Chardonnay and talking about, end quote, community standards, end quote, while my family's history was rotting in a dump? What would you have done if you came home to find a stranger had locked the doors to your own life and told the world you were dead? Do we have a right to be, end quote, unstable, end quote, when a world we're fighting for decides to sell itself out while our backs are turned, or is the real, end quote, instability, end quote, the fact that we let people like Regina hold the keys in the first place? Drop a comment and tell me if you think I went too far, or if you think I should have dragged that gate all the way to her front door. I'm curious to see where you draw the line when the front line comes to your own backyard.